Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this panel event. The panel is presented by the CSUSB Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds, and also the CSUSB Conversations on Race and Policing. The panel is Against Racism, Intersectional Justice for and in Palestine. And I want to start first by passing over to Robbie Madrigal from the Fowle Library.
Thank you, Jeremy. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory of the ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous peoples. Jeremy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Robbie. And I'll start by introducing Dr. Loubna Qutami. She is a professor of media studies and the director of the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds at CSUSB. Her research interests include digital communication, social media, social justice, and diasporic communities. Her most recent project is her award-winning documentary, 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. Professor Qutami. Can you unmute?
Okay, now I can unmute. Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Ask for someone. Thank you very much. I would like to start by actually thanking our center, of course, and the university for allowing us this space. And I would like to thank the organizers of the Conversations on Race and Policing, especially Dr. Jeremy Morey, who actually had been wonderful in putting all of this last minute. I would like to thank also Robbie Madrigal for his work with us, and thank you for the land acknowledgement, and the library for hosting it, and Dr. Mary Texiera for allowing us also this space as an organizer of the Race and Policing series. I would like to start also by acknowledging that I live in the so-called Temecula Valley, which sits on the unceded, colonized, indigenous land of the Pichanga tribes of the Liwizano First Nation in Riverside. So what we are going to do is, after this introduction, is that we would like for every one of our esteemed speakers to speak for a few minutes, about 5 minutes or so, have opening statements or remarks, and I will introduce each one just before they speak. After that, we will have a discussion, a panelist discussion, and if panelists would like to respond to each other. The last thing would be Q&A. For now, I would like to just give the context of this event that we would love to probably have as a series starting in fall. So because of what has been happening in Palestine in terms of apartheid and ethnic cleansing from Jerusalem and other parts of Palestine by the Israeli army and the Israeli government, and because of the slaughter in Gaza at the hands of the Israelis, our center actually issued a statement. Our center is the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds. We issued a statement, and we shared the statement on several listservs of our school, CSUSB. Unfortunately, within hours, we received a very racist email from one of our faculty members. And that was not the first time for her, actually, to post very racist, claims, including citing the war criminal Golda Meir, the Israeli war criminal Golda Meir, as saying something to the extent that there would be no peace in the area until Arabs start loving their children more than they hate us, meaning the Israelis. And that was only one example of a slew of other racist comments that she used in her email. So that's language that should not be accepted in academia and should be totally rejected and should be eliminated actually from any discourse in academia. There is no room for racism in any, not only academic context, but in any context actually. And we are thankful for this series on race and policing for joining us in actually putting a strong statement against it. I would like to thank the university president, President Morales, and the administration for actually taking a very strong and firm stance and send out a very strong unconditional statement against racism, denouncing that racist content. And I hope that that person, that faculty member, would actually be held accountable beyond just the denouncement. So having provided this this context, of course, and the historical context also as what is happening in Palestine, and I will let the speaker actually expand on those issues. I would like you to check our statement. It's posted on our website, the website of the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds, and I think Dr. Murray actually put it in the chat. Having said that, I think we are ready to move on to our first speaker. All right. Our first speaker is Dr. Loubna Qutami, and I'm very thankful for every one of the speakers for agreeing to participate with a very short notice. Dr. Loubna Qutami is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Dr. Qutami is a co-founder of the Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM, and the former executive director of the Arab Cultural and Community Center, ACC, in San Francisco. Dr. Loubna Qutami, it's all yours now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahlam Muhtasib, and thank you to all the attendees. I'm really honored to be sharing the space with the panelists. I come to you today from the unceded territory of the Gabrielano and Tongva peoples, and I find it very important not just to acknowledge this land, but to continue to think about it in terms of our life practice as a Palestinian myself, and as the daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees who, very similarly to indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, were dispossessed from our homeland and prohibited from returning indefinitely. I'd like to start off just today by talking a little bit about the current developments unfolding in Palestine. I think by now most people have seen that the month of May, we all bore witness to mounting crisis in Palestine, and every day the developments, the news was reporting increased numbers of killed people, increased numbers of violence, intensifying violence that I think for a lot of folks who weren't able to follow along really daily, it was very difficult to sort of fully comprehend what exactly was happening and the really important, the importance of this particular political moment. This series, which is often being referred to as a conflict or a flare-up in media today, or the way that many people are engaging it, is really what I'd like to think of as a combustion of the full 73 years of settler colonialism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. It began with a court order ordinance from the Israeli courts that legally legitimized the eviction of Palestinians from the Jerusalem town of Sheikh Jarrah. During that same period, as settlers were sort of moving in, tormenting, harassing the inhabitants of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, the Israeli state was sending out its police forces to sort of police the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in the old city of Jerusalem. This was also during the holy month of Ramadan, so Palestinians were going to Jerusalem to worship, and were really being prohibited from accessing their holy sites, and then beaten and brutalized in the streets as the intensification had continued. As we saw unfold throughout the days, Palestinian citizens of the Israeli state, so these are Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, whose families succeeded in remaining on the land of historic Palestine, or were internally displaced with what became the borders of the Israeli state. They started rising up saying, you know, we are Palestinian, we are being beaten, brutalized, discriminated against by the Israeli state, even though we are holders of Israeli citizenship. they sort of joined this movement. And at this point, we really started to see that there was something different unfolding in Palestine, because once Palestinians in historic Palestine, the 1948 lands, what's currently called Israel, once they joined the movements to protect Jerusalem, the town of Sheikh Jarrah, the Al-Aqsa compound, we saw a massive police and military crackdown on these protesters. And this included firing of rubber bullets, which aren't really rubber bullets. They're steel bullets coated in rubber. We were seeing people beaten and brutalized in the streets. We were seeing people, mass arrests of young Palestinian protesters. And so this really set off, this was really the spark that lit the flame, for that's been brewing for so long. And what we started to hear coming from the streets of Palestine was that this isn't just about the Jerusalem town of Sheikh Jarrah. This isn't just about the 60 apartheid-like policies that are on the books in the Israeli state that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. This is about the big picture. This is about the 1948 Palestinian Nakba, which is what Palestinians refer to the events of 1948 when the Israeli state was created, and it resulted in the exodus of 750,000 Palestinians, the theft of their homes, the destruction and demolition of 500 towns and villages. People were also arguing this isn't just about what happened in 1948, it's about the ongoing catastrophe that Palestinians continue to endure. Continuous ethnic cleansing campaigns in Jerusalem, the ongoing military occupation of the West Bank, which includes security outposts, military checkpoints, a wall, a concrete wall that divides Palestinian lands and makes it impossible for Palestinians to go to school or work or visit family or go to hospitals or seek medical attention freely, right? And it's also about a 15-year-long blockade siege on the Gaza Strip, a blockade that includes the Israeli military sealing off the Gaza Strip by land, sea, and sky, prohibiting any goods or people from entering or leaving freely, and which has resulted in the Gaza Strip being regarded as one of the most densely populated places on earth and the largest open air prisons in the world. Since 2006, since the blockade was implemented in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli state has conducted over 40 wars on the Gaza Strip, 4 of which in 2009, 2012, 2014, and now in 2021 have included massive war airstrike assaults. This has resulted in the death of thousands of Palestinians. It has resulted in the injury of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. It has resulted in the displacement, second or third time refugeehood or displacement of hundreds of thousands of displacement. And it's been 15 years, right? So as we started to see the protests mounting inside of the Israeli state and inside of Jerusalem, we also then finally got to the point where the Israelis waged a full-blown 11-day airstrike campaign on the Gaza Strip, a site that already has the highest suicide rates in the world, the highest mental health crisis rates in the world, one of the highest poverty rates in the world, a site that already in every Israeli incursion, its main infrastructure, whether that's water sanitation systems or sewage systems, has been completely obliterated. A site that has had to grieve so much life and even have to deal with, this sounds so, crude to say, but even having to deal with reburying their dead after cemeteries are blown up. That's the condition of the Gaza Strip, right? That has been the condition of what Palestinians are living in the Gaza Strip for a very long time. So I just mention all this to sort of show the broader colonial architecture that segments Palestinians into these different constituencies with these different kind of systemic forms of oppression, because a lot of these different experiences can parallel the different struggles of communities globally, and particularly here in Turtle Island, whether that's a struggle against borders, a struggle against carceral regimes, against imprisonment, against torture in the prison cells, a struggle against war and imperialism, a struggle against a racial caste system where by law, there are 60 laws that discriminate against a population that's even legally considered citizens, right? So these are sort of the main things that Palestinians have been enduring for 73 years. And this particular last month was a moment where all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in Jerusalem, in 1948 historic lands, in the West Bank, and the 5 million Palestinian refugees who are still stateless, who hold no citizenship other than a United Nations identity card, who reside throughout historic Palestine and the broader Arab region. They all rose up together, all of these constituencies. And many Palestinians in diaspora, such as myself, such as Dr. Muhtasib, we joined their calls saying that, you know, perhaps for us, we might have some privilege in the sense that our material lives and bodies and homes and families are not on the line. But we too here in the United States have had to deal with the intergenerational experience of exodus and pain and our family and friends being under the boot of a colonial occupation in Palestine, and then constant forms of torment, harassment, Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, anti-Palestinian sentiment. And what's really been sort of evident in the last decade is the constant silencing and criminalization of Palestinian voices. Every time we speak, we are labeled a particular way. Every time we are active in advocating for justice in Palestine, trying to incorporate Palestine in our teaching pedagogy, in our scholarship, in our organizing work, trying to speak freely about Palestine, trying to engage in nonviolent works of protest, whether that's cultural work or academic work, we are being demonized, criminalized, silenced, whether it's by, you know, at the highest level of government. The Trump administration was trying to pass an executive order that conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or at the private level, the private corporation level, companies like Zoom and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook who are, you know, eliminating posts about what's happening in Palestine, or whether it's at universities where students are being doxxed and bullied and attacked, and academics are being attacked and unable to freely engage in a rigorous scholarly practice on the teaching and studying of Palestine. So this is sort of the broad view of what has been going on now and the struggle that Palestinian communities back home and here in the United States are experiencing, as well as all those who are the co-strugglers of Palestinians, those who stand for justice in Palestine, and those who are making the really crucial links between the struggle in Palestine and the struggle of indigenous peoples, of Black communities, of communities who have been affected by war and displacement, immigrant and refugee communities, and so forth. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Qutami. That was very informative and very helpful, actually, to continue with the rest of guest speakers, setting, you know, the tone really for the rest of the presentations. So as I said at the beginning, we are actually very grateful that we have a list of amazing speakers, and I will introduce our next guest speaker, who is Dr. Lisa Rofel. Professor Rofel is a Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's a national board member of Jewish Voice for Peace and was for many years co-director of California Scholars for Academic Freedom, which I serve on also, and I served on, and remains on the executive committee. So Dr. Rofel, it's all yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ahlam and Jeremy, for organizing this event. It's very, very important, and I feel honored to be here with all of you. I just want to say that I live in Ramaytush land, unceded Ramaytush land, which is San Francisco, called San Francisco today. And I want to encourage people who are, if you're in Northern California, to pay land tax to the Seguridad Land Trust. And I don't know if there's a land trust in Southern California, but if there is, you could pay land tax to them also. Okay, I know I'm going to raise really big issues in this small amount of time, so I'll try to keep as much to time as possible. The first large issue, I mean, we can discuss them all in the discussion Q&A. My first point has to do with Zionism. The history of Zionism shows very clearly that Zionism was a project born of European settler colonialism, combined with ethno-nationalism. It embraced the racism at the heart of European colonialism and the exclusions of nationalism. From the very beginning, we do not have to go far to confirm this history. The founders of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, Zabotinsky, and others were not at all shy about proclaiming their views. You can go read their speeches and writings for yourselves. They asserted from the beginning that the founding of a state for Jews in Palestine would have to mean removing the indigenous peoples from the land of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing was always, always the goal of Zionism. The most recent horrendous violence against Palestinians is in line with what the Israeli state has been doing since 1948, trying to remake all the land of Palestine for Jews only. For all these reasons, I have transformed from someone raised to love and support Israel with all my heart and soul to an anti-Zionist Jew. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. Our rabbi taught us that Judaism stands for social justice. Let me say very clearly, Israel has nothing to do with the moral and ethical principles of Judaism and everything to do with trying to hold on to its racist apartheid rule over Palestinians. My second point has to do with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a form of racial prejudice and hatred and should always be condemned. As someone who was raised as an Orthodox Jew and I lived in a very strong Jewish community, I grew up with plenty of anti-Semitism. I will never forget those experiences. The recent attacks on Jews that blame all Jewish people for the actions of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic. I also equally condemn the weaponization of anti-Semitism used to continue Israel's oppression of Palestinians. The organizations and activists leading the Palestinian freedom movement have been resoundingly clear that anti-Semitism has no place in the movement, which is guided by principles of human rights and anti-racism. Jewish Voice for Peace, of which I am a board member, is a progressive Jewish organization that works for Palestinian liberation. And JVP has also stated Palestinian liberation and dismantling anti-Semitism are intertwined. What makes me personally angry is how supporters of the Israeli government, including many in the American Jewish establishment, are misrepresenting fringe and widely condemned acts of individual anti-Semitism as characteristic of the broader Palestinian human rights movement. Those who want to suppress the movement for Palestinian liberation refuse to acknowledge how the Trump administration fostered and supported white supremacist anti-Semitism. We now live in a moment when US white supremacists and Christian evangelicals give full support to Israel, especially because they view it as a nation ruled by a belief in supremacy of one group, even as they express their full anti-Semitism here in the United States. In fact, they support Israel more wholeheartedly than a majority of Jews in the United States right now. JVP supports Palestinians' right to describe their lived experiences without being accused of anti-Semitism. Similarly, we refuse to allow progressive leaders of color who speak out in support of Palestinian rights to be smeared for their principled stand. My third point is about boycott, divestment, sanctions. Crafted by Palestinian civil society groups in 2006, BDS has been the main call from Palestinians to the international community. I support BDS, and so does JVP, because it is the main nonviolent means to end Israel's violent military rule over Palestinians. The call to BDS urges us to apply the same nonviolent pressure used to end South African apartheid to Israel until the Israel government complies with international law by meeting three demands. One, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands occupied in June 1967 and dismantling the separation wall. Two, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And three, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. Jewish Voice for Peace recently sent out a letter to Jewish leaders, activists, and scholars that said as follows. The Israeli government says that the Jewish future belongs to those who dominate, who bomb civilians, who throw people out of their homes. Today, we say that our Jewish past, present, and future belongs to those of us who are fighting for the well-being of all people in all places. By signing this pledge of their letter, we commit ourselves to engaging our communities, our organizations, our synagogues, and our families in joining us to finally end apartheid in Palestine and Israel. Let me end by saying the ceasefire in Gaza does not mean Israel has ceased its violence against Palestinians. Yet I have never been more hopeful than now that we will see Palestinian liberation in my lifetime. Palestinians everywhere are speaking about a renewed sense of unity and determination to bring forward the day that they are free of occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism in their land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rofel. That was wonderful. And thank you for your unwavering support for social justice in general, especially on this panel for Palestinians. Our next esteemed speaker is our very own Dr. James Fenelon. Professor Fenelon is a professor and director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Studies at California State University, San Bernardino. He published Redskins, Mascots, Indian Nations, After Culturicide, Resistance and Survival of the Lakota, Sioux Nation, and Indigenous Peoples and Globalization with Thomas Hall, and is working on Indian, Black, and Irish Capitalism, Colonization, and Racism in America by Routledge. Professor Fenelon published numerous articles and chapters, about 36 of those, is Lakota, Standing Rock, with Gaulish, Irish, French, Scandinavian descent, and advocates for justice, for social justice around the world. And it's all yours, Dr. Fenelon.
Dakota person would say, how me taku yepe, greetings to my relatives, especially the relatives that have already spoken, that's all people, and might say ampeto washtelo, is a good day. I live and work from indigenous homelands of the Serrano, Yohaviatam, Tongva, Vanyume, Kawia, and Chemehuevi people. I am from Dakota, Midewakantawan, and Lakota relatives, and I recognize my Gaelic, Irish, Scandinavian, and French ancestry. Thank you, Professor. My primary position here is to do a comparative analysis of indigenous peoples and the struggles in the Palestine. And I want to thank as has already been said, with the organizers, as well as thank them for the honor of speaking on such powerful issues. We also identify ourselves in our relationship to our indigeneity, which is important in this kind of a presentation. I might say, I come from the place where the rock stands upright. And I also identify myself as a member of a Native nation and a veteran both of the Native movements as well as the United States, but see myself as a citoyen du monde with global commitment. We also, oh my gosh, you know what? I had two sets of PowerPoints here, and this is the wrong one. So, and slideshow.
No problem at all.
I had two ones up. Let's just go right back to it. No wonder I think people were like, should I get the right one here? Okay, here we go. All right. Okay, so
we know you are very busy and you must be preparing for.
Actually, I do have another presentation and I had pulled that one on up. Okay, let's go right back to it. I've got too many slides and I'm going to have to go, and we'll cut out a few as best we can. So here you see something that makes sense. The whole idea is to look at indigenous and looking at a sense of moving.
You haven't shared actually.
Oh, okay.
Share the screen, please.
Okay, let's. Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry, I have two screens, which is I use for my son's gaming operation. And what it does is it allows me to do many things. Okay, I'll skip over even more, but that's okay. Hopefully you can see this. It's indigenous against racism, intersectional justice for in Palestine. Is that the right slide presentation? Okay, great. Now we're ready to rock and roll. All right. So basically, I've already done a land and water acknowledgement. We want to focus on two things for this comparative analysis, that this recognizes the indigenous people stewarded this land, and this was throughout the generations. Here's what I just was sharing with you. We identify our own indigeneity as well as our different ethnic backgrounds and how that shapes our presentation. When we do this, we also acknowledge that this brings in a responsibility toward what we call the traditional and unceded territory. And I want to focus on unceded. Recently, you just heard someone acknowledge the so-called Gabrieleno, but especially the Tongva. And we'd say many of the struggles that you would see in a more violent fashion right now in the Palestine, we can also find in North America and Turtle Island. So this means we're focusing, and we would say, what does it mean to be indigenous and say unceded land? If land is taken without treaty or international agreement, should it be seen as unceded, i.e. the West Bank settlements? If people have lived on land and in homes for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, are they indigenous more or less? And this is my great friend Luke Madrigal. The weekend, they did an all-night sing for him and an incredible passing on to the spirits. He passed away a year ago, but they did the full recognition this weekend. And it reminded me of how powerful these traditions are and what must be going on in various places in Palestine now. If we look at these frames of progress, we see that simply by making these acknowledgements and looking at this history, we have a responsibility for the historical taking and the injustices accompanied with those. We need to focus on restorative justice, especially from an indigenous frame. We must give voice to all the people and the narratives using a frame, something like Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom. The frame that I bring is one when we were interviewing indigenous peoples, Lakota and Dakota peoples along the Minnesota, when their land had been dammed. They didn't refer to much as the stolen land as the taken land. And it was in other words, the land that was taken from them and viewed that way. We can also add water to that perspective, and that's especially important in Palestine. We can also look at Tovangar, which is a greater Los Angeles area, and see we need to identify where all of the villages and people were, in this case, Palestinian people, before the set of situations that come about, and how they resisted invasion, and they remember these historical events. And that leads to indigenous history, art, identity, and education and politics that are different, in this case, from the United States, or in the Palestine, different from the dominant state, Israel, and then how the people see this passing on to the generations. And then we need to listen to these stories and put them into, and this is what we recently did here, not a simple consultation. Being a consultant to decision makers does not make it. It must be citizen involvement, in this case, tribal citizens, under their terms. This is how bird singers, this is, by the way, the man who just was sent to the spirit world, but these are traditional people that open that in a way that is respectful to all people and all life forms, right? And then we see this other issue of what is called federal recognition in indigenous territory versus the state versus a tribal identity versus a sense of community. And by the way, a rejection of the notion of being disadvantaged in the sense of the traditional indigenous perspective is it's an advantage to have this kind of a history. You bring it to your perspective. And then also, of course, here, as has been brought up, for instance, the mosque, there's an idea of sacred lands. And these have spiritual relationships with ceremonial sites. You know, Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and other places, has more ceremonial sites for more than one religion, as we all know. And then how this gets structured into inequality. And then if we had more time, we might look at that as a traditional person doing that. Now, I borrowed this common mem out on the internet for looking at, for doing it comparatively. So you see on the left, we'd have the colonial incursions starting with pre-Zionism Palestine, and on the right we have the pre-United States, pre-colonized United States. And just look at each period. You know, the new states are growing after the colonial incursions. That's number 2. Number 3 would be the new states growing, and then you see the new states colonizing, and then creation dominance. And then in the last set, a complete set of takings, where both produce apartheid-like structures using what we could call internal colonialism. For instance, in the Palestine, internal colonialism would, in my estimation, apply inside of Israel. Settler colonialism would apply in West Bank. And in the Gaza, the very painful kind of creation of Bantustan-like prison cities. This is total state control over all sectors of the society, right? If we had more time, we'd look at how racialized internal colonialism is set up. It always has borders that are racialized, always. There are always uprisings to this. There's resistance to it because it's a violent process. In this case, we could look at Palestinian towns. So this is Standing Rock, and we can often tell those same stories there, and then the nature of the leadership. We're really talking about empire and race, and how racism is an effect of that, and the rise of expansionary empires, and then independence movements. And this is why we focus on the walls. And we see that they represent white and Western color and civilization and borders and global wars. Sometimes we look at this, especially in terms of Mexico, we really just don't have the time. In fact, we look at different indigenous peoples around the world. I'm just gonna skip over this, and I apologize for that. Slip in a picture of myself there. On my first set of visits, I've got 2 visits here. One's in 2004, and we see the initial setting up of the so-called Jewish state, seriously favoring Israel versus the so-called Arab state or whatever it would be. We see that Jerusalem was supposed to have been an international zone. We all know a lot of the stories from that, but out of that arises the concept of walls and resistance to the walls, specifically within Bethlehem and Jerusalem, but certainly without the entire West Bank now. And that creates a stateless society. It is typical of indigenous and Palestinian struggles around the world, so that Israel becomes a metaphor of Western civilization and Islam becomes the other. And these, sometimes we talk about the creation of those walls and the technology and machinery of those systems. And we sometimes look at pacification of resistance forces. And we can do that up in the Dakotas as well. So then we see the further inclusion within those borders and the setting up of walls that is a more taking of land and then resistance within that. And then those walls become physical locations, all right? We also see that the savage, as we see with the doctrine of discovery with indigenous peoples, and the uncivilized becomes those who resist, and that becomes the enemy. With the Lakota and Dakota, my own relatives, they become the enemy icon. And then we see that settlements create this idea of settlers and hostiles and build settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, withdrawing the residency rights for Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem, and then creating the need for entry permits to go onto your own land, right? If we had more time, I'd look at how each of my works builds toward what we're looking at now, or we can look at models. This is from Indigenous Peoples and Globalization, models of how those works come on out. I want to briefly take you to Standing Rock and the rise of the Sacred Stone Camp, which was a resistance against this, and compare that to the Palestinian movement, where teaching becomes movement, resistance becomes conflict, and military occupation gets reflected in these checkpoints in Indian reservations of the 1800s. So that I had been in the West Bank, and I have some pictures from that, and going through these heavy militarized, where often a lot of the Palestinian people are debased in very powerful ways, or they can be arrested and imprisoned. So I'm headed down here to our Ocheti, Shakawin, and Red Warrior camps. And what do I run into? A checkpoint going to this. I used to work at the tribal college. I drove this, it's a beautiful drive, even in the wintertime. And I run into a military checkpoint, which is not quite as violent, but looks exactly like the ones I just left in the West Bank. And they would not let me pass. And then a few days later, after the Obama statement, we were coming back up from Standing Rock. And what did they do? They'd replaced the SWAT teams with National Guard troops, heavily armed. Now hadn't been a single incident at this checkpoint. What are you doing? Okay, what you're doing is suggesting to the general populace, these are the Indian wars. These are the hostiles. And they literally said, do you know what the Indians are doing down there, right? So this sets up 4 points that are shared between the Palestinian and the people on Standing Rock. These are their ancestral homelands, and they're resisting for their beautiful families. New immigrants are living in fortified settlements. Heavily armed troops and law enforcement separate the peoples out of checkpoints and document controls. And even nonviolent resistance is framed as hostile. For instance, on Standing Rock, protesters, water protectors were termed literally as jihadis by private security forces. And so here are some of the pictures. If we had more time, we could talk about that. This one is especially powerful. Why did they line up all these forces on the other side of concertina razor wire? Nobody's going through that. And then we would look at that. This is what a traditional elder shared with me. It's a bit of a critique of settler colonialism. She says, watch out, we were the first settlers. And so I say the Palestinians were the first settlers. So watch out for that word, because it's their word, she said. And then she goes, the true unceded land, go to the other side of the Missouri. That's traditional territory that we never ceded, never. You know, powerful stuff with these traditionals. That's the woman on the right, Mary Louise Defender. That's the famous face spotted eagle. And then, of course, Winona LaDuke, so that each generation is passing this on as the mothers of the earth to each following generation. Trying to widen this on up, I was going to say we can look at this. I do want to bring up the 3 major points in the center there. The United States has supported the dominance and expansion of Israel using, this is racism, unequal institutional discrimination, second-class citizenship for Palestinians in Israel. By the way, it's increasingly moving into soft apartheid inside of Israel. Suppressed ethnic segregation and non-citizenship in the West Bank. Especially because of travel documents. Okay, so this is clear apartheid. And total suppression of stateless people in Gaza with little to no rights to redress justice, which is as intense racism as basically exists. And it looks a lot like Pine Ridge of 1890, which led to the Wounded Knee killing. So you're totally surrounded by military forces, and the slightest conflict leads to death and destruction. I call it a triadic separation, and some of the West Bank and other places look like Bantustans or reservations at different times in American history. So just ending this, we like to, especially because Luke and now Julia has passed on. So these are people who are working to do this work here. And when we do this, we make the point that we call on the spirits to honor the earth, water, and people who live on Turtle Island, including our brothers and sisters in Palestine. I would say, Omitakawe Oyasin. We are all related. Let us show each other respect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fennell. Thank you. I really appreciate your amazing presentation and the links you made. And I'm sorry if we rushed you. We could actually have went, like I could have listened to you forever, honestly. But thank you very much for sharing all of this wealth with us, especially about our indigenous nations in the United States and their traditions. And now, last but not least, our very own Dr. Mary Teixeira, who's very, very popular and who is actually very important for the success of the series under which we are actually congregating and using the space of the conversations on race and policing. Dr. Teixeira teaches in the Department of Sociology with an intersectional approach, concentrating on race, class, and gender. She sees many parallels between the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement to free Palestine. And she's joining us now. So Dr. Teixeira, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be on this distinguished panel to speak about something that is an urgent conversation because in real time, people are suffering because of what we are talking about today. I am reporting to you from Brooklyn, New York, on the ancestral lands of the Algonquin. And it will not surprise those of you who are here that there are very few Algonquin in New York, New Jersey, as they were before. We say the names: Manhattan, Manhasset, But we don't have them because of a little thing called the Trail of Tears, where thousands were removed from the East Coast and taken to what was called Indian country. And so I want to acknowledge that I am reporting from stolen land, and we are very, very respectful of that. It will not surprise you also that Dr. Fenelon and I are both sociologists, so my presentation is pretty much the same, not quite as smooth as his, but there are a few things that I did want to acknowledge and to talk about. James used the expressions imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, and those are certainly parallels. We see parallels with, you know, those actions in Palestine, in the United States, what we call the United States or Turtle Island, and then in South Africa also. These are all settler colonies. These entail people coming in, outsiders coming in, using God, by the way. Manifest Destiny says, you know, God has, he has deigned that the civilized nations of the world shall bring civilization to the uncivilized nations of the world. And we are declaring ourselves as the civilized nations of the world. And what does imperialism, colonialism entail? Well, it entails rounding people up. It entails outlawing language and culture. It entails hurting people like animals, you know, in the Trail of Tears, controlling their movements, denigrating the culture. You know, growing up, I thought, you know, Black folks never contributed anything because that's what I was taught. And I was taught by Black nuns. Nevertheless, you know, I had all the classical education, but didn't know anything about myself. So whether it's the Palestinians or the Uyghurs or the Black Latino lives are heavily controlled by authority. We kill those folks with impunity. People like Ahmaud Arbery, people like Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, with very little having to answer for. The space is taken over by the authority of the state. I recall living in Los Angeles in the 1960s and reading on my own, not through school, reading about the history of Chavez Ravine, which is the home of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And many of us don't know, because that history has been suppressed, that was a thriving Latino community, but they didn't count. They didn't count. So there were excuses used, right? We're going to break up this community of hundreds of people to build a low-cost housing. And of course, we know that low-cost housing never happened because the Dodgers came along. Roger O'Malley decided that he wanted to move the Dodgers from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so we just take people off of their lands and use them. We just celebrated Rosewood, California, Rosewood, Kansas, Rosewood, Florida. And we actually, it was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa, what some people call a riot, but what I call, and many others increasingly are calling, a massacre. Over 300 African Americans were slaughtered by the white citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, based on a report of a young Black man raping a woman. But just coincidentally, that area was very, very prosperous. They called it the Black Wall Street. This was the first time an incendiary device has been dropped from a plane on our country, and that was in the area of Black Wall Street or Greenwood, Oklahoma. But there are many, many examples of that. The massacres of Latinos, the massacres of Chinese, the massacres of African Americans in this settler colony, in this colony that was taken over by Europeans. And so we see many, many parallels. The lives of people, of the people of color, the indigenous people, the people who were kidnapped and brought here from Africa, those lives have not mattered. And that's why it is necessary to say Palestinian lives matter, Black lives matter, Latino lives matter. It would not be necessary for us to say that if we had been treated as if our lives mattered. And I think, we have seen much evidence that that our lives do not matter. And the answer, I think, lies in raising our voices to tell the truth in panels like this one, so that we can free ourselves and free people all over the world, whether it's the indigenous people of Australia or Palestinians. This is all the same. And for us to silence ourselves because we are afraid of being called anti-Semites, it does not do justice to the Palestinian people. I think it is necessary for us to take that risk. It is the risk that does not involve ending our lives as happening in Palestine. So I look forward to the question and answers, and I am again very honored to be here. And I'm going to stop now because I can feel my blood pressure rising. So I will stop and I will hand it back over to my colleague. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry about my phone.
Thank you, Dr. Teixeira, and thank you for the ending. It's a very powerful ending because this is exactly what I argued for last week when I talked about the racist email that came, from one of our faculty members. I said her discourse, that faculty's discourse, or colonial logic really is very similar to the colonial logic that enabled the colonization of the Americas by dehumanizing, of course, the indigenous people of the Americas. It's the same colonial logic that allowed or permitted the enslavement, the slavery of Black people through the dehumanization of Black people. It's the same process of enabling the Holocaust through the dehumanization of Jews. So it's a very similar process of putting people as subhuman or second class, citizens, etc., or human beings even. So thank you for bringing that up and for calling for people to stand up for justice. So now we could take probably 10 to 15 minutes for an internal conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And I have two invocations. The first one is open for anyone. And I noticed that every one of you kind of told a story, right? Every one of you used the narrative style to discuss or to make your points across. And that actually reminds me of a very important practice that many of us, scholars who call for the decolonization of knowledge or take a decolonial approach to knowledge, call for. And we call for mainly two things. The first one is focusing on the oral history tradition, and it's important in discussing such crucial issues. And the second one is the role of history and centering the historical context of any conversation, especially when we are talking about indigenous populations. So I would like you to comment on those aspects. How do you feel about the importance of those two elements? And I share with you a very quick anecdote. So on Friday, I participated in a similar panel that was put on by UCR last minute. And I was grateful, to be invited. I usually don't actually share a platform with Zionists, I'm going to be honest, because it's like forcing, let's say Black people, Black activists to sit with the KKK members, right? So I reject that. But there was actually a Zionist on the panel. And what was interesting is that person, after I gave the historical context, kept on saying, let's move on, let's move on. Talking about history just is going to be tit for tat, and it complicates the narrative and history, and the conflict now is untrackable. And it's not true. How convenient it is, actually, how convenient for the colonizer to tell us, just move on, right? And forget about history. So that was my response, actually. And I said, actually, it's kind of even violent to request from us to forget about history when you are the colonizer and we are the colonized. So can each one of you speak to what I just said, those important aspects of the conversation? If you want to skip this, that's fine. Whoever would like to address this, because I have another invocation and I want to ask about specifically the term settler colonialism. And I know Dr. James Fenelon has a lot to say about that. So that would be my next one. But for now, who would like to start?
I can begin. That's such a great, well, first of all, thank you everyone of the panelists for your really insightful words. I learned a lot and been thinking a lot about what you've been saying. I think this question is so important about the story, about the right to the story, about the right to narrate. And I mean, Edward Said 40 years ago wrote an essay called Permission to Narrate as a Palestinian. And I think that it's still a struggle that Palestinians experience today. I do think it's a part of asserting Palestinian stories and voice and maintaining sort of the lineage in between generations about not only what has happened to us as Palestinians, but our own cultural practices, our own forms of cultural wisdom, a lot of which is rooted in our lands and in our, our ancestral history. It's so important because it's maintaining what we Palestinians call samud, or steadfastness, our steadfast ability for those of us who are in the homeland to stay on the land. For those of us who are in exile, who are in refugee camps, the steadfast will to return to the land, the steadfast will to attain freedom as a Palestinian, whether it's in our homeland or globally. And part of that freedom, of course, is freedom from a colonial enterprise that has established a war military apparatus on our historic homeland that has completely transformed the landscape, right? A lot of times we get these liberal Zionists coming and talking to us about like, oh, but Israel's so, a leader in, ecologically friendly or agriculturally sophisticated development. We've grown avocados in a place that they were never grown. It's like, okay, your 20,000 avocado trees are directly entangled with the uprooting and demolition and burning of 500,000 indigenous Palestinian olive trees that have probably been there for thousands of years, right? What does that do to our history and to the people who live off of those olive trees, right? But I mean, I think that why I'm saying that the story gives so much steadfastness in between these generations is because the Palestinian story is under constant attack. And this is sort of what I meant earlier when I was talking about the attack on Palestinian narratives through criminalizing Palestinian activism, criminalizing advocates for justice in Palestine, erasing posts on social media, prohibiting hires of Palestinian scholars, punishing Palestinians for speaking out, right? Maintaining a hegemonic narrative about Zionism that endorses and supports the colonial occupation in Palestine and that erases any voices of dissent. So for Palestinians, we really understand the story, not just as a form of perseverance and a form of steadfastness, but as a direct form of resistance. It's a direct form of us resisting banishment, the same way they forced us off of our lands, transformed those landscapes, forced us into exile or into refugee camps or internally displaced into other concentrated areas surrounded by walls and checkpoints and siege military infrastructure. There's that constant physical forcible banishment, but there's also the sort of banishment of Palestine, the erasure of Palestine from world maps, the erasure of Palestinians from history textbooks, the looting and decimation of Palestinian archives. And every single Israeli incursion, one of the first targets is always a Palestinian archive. So that kind of attack on the epistemological fabric, on the cultural fabric of society, is just as much a form of genocide as the actual forced physical killing. And I think a lot of us as Palestinians have learned that very clearly from our indigenous siblings across the world, who have said the attack on your cultural practice, the attack on narrative, on your epistemological and cultural terrains is deeply interwoven into the project of genocide, as much as the forced physical removal is.
Thank you very much. Anyone else would like to comment on centering history and or grounding the conversation in history, especially oral histories and narratives?
I just want to just pick up on what Loubna said, a term she used, which is erasure. I think that this is another common tactic of colonialists, imperialists all over the world. You know, you take them off the map, you make the map smaller, you make Africa the smallest continent when it's really one of the largest. You know, it is a systematic for 500 years doing the erasure, or at the very least, making people believe that they don't count, so that they tend to erase themselves because I don't count. I mean, I know so many people in my generation, little girls and boys who grew up wanting to be white because they did not consider themselves beautiful or important or smart. And so I believe that there is a psychic harm that has been done to the victims of imperialism and colonialism. And we see that, we see the evidence of that. When Claude Steele does his experiment with kids and taking SAT exams, if they're in the room with white kids, they don't do well. But if they're in the room by themselves, they do well. And I think that's another, just an outcome of this psychic assault. The Germans knew how to do it. They had a minister of propaganda. We don't call our folks ministers of propaganda, but nevertheless, you know, the result is the same.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I could just say 2 sentences. I think it's very important for Jews who are strongly critical of Israel's oppression of Palestinians to speak from their histories, because of the Zionist strategy of assuming they speak for all Jews. So it's very important not to let that happen. So that's why I do include my personal experiences, although in the beginning I didn't really want to. I thought I would just speak from a position of social justice without specifying, but I actually think it's really important to challenge that Zionist strategy. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Rofel. And actually, to add to your point, I totally agree with you. And I know sometimes you, as you said, you just want to speak for justice and not necessarily position or center your own experience. But I think it's very important, actually, and very helpful. And on that, on Friday, on that panel, one of the students actually challenged the Zionist professor and said, does that mean that you should stop talking about the Holocaust and your experiences and getting reparations from the German government? And so she actually, the student challenged the professor, who didn't really know how to answer. So thank you for that. Dr. Fennell, would you like to address this, or would you like us to talk about settler colonialism?
Well, if you'd like, I could provide a segue into that.
Yes.
My first book and work is called Culturicide, linked to genocide, but it's for the destruction of the culture. And a huge part of that is the destruction of the narrative, the storytelling, the links to the land, and the ability to tell that history from an indigenous perspective. which is in a newer set of contexts and context, essentially what is happening in the Palestine by the dominant state. And I know that in an earlier set of interactions that you probably remember, I brought up something I made, what I think most people agreed was a pretty powerful statement, but then I talked about my own journey. Now, you know, from the indigenous perspective, I learned about, here's one, a narrative that was destroyed in the University of California has recently had to grapple with big time, a lot of Native scholars. California was based on pure applied genocide of its indigenous peoples with a death rate higher than that of the Jewish people in the Holocaust in Europe, higher than that, right? And it was a pure war of extermination, literally said that way with bounties paid. And one of the examples we use, I sometimes use, is besides the people I showed you that have stories, is a good friend of mine up at CSU Humboldt who took us to a place called Yantakit. You can find that place where they were in ceremony, a world renewal ceremony, and the so-called settler militias attacked them knowing that all the villagers would be there and killed most of them, including, you know, babies they threw into fires and children, used body parts to claim the bounties provided by the United States government, and then used that money to pay the homesteader fees to take the land, right? So it is this pure applied genocide that exists anywhere in the world. And yet where was that taught? I'm not just talking about, you know, K through 12 education. I'm not talking about I'm talking about the best universities and colleges of the land. And so when we look at that, we do something which is my other topic, which I believe you're referring to, and that is to break down this idea of settler colonialism. Because when we do genocide studies, and in my work, I spend a lot of time without looking at indigenous native genocides, because a lot of that's been very contested. So I go right to a series of well-known scholars who specialize on the Holocaust and other genocides. And the very first, there's a series of 5 steps. I like to use Helen Fine's five steps, right? The very first thing you must ID is to identify the perpetrator by name. So we don't say, you know, white people did this to us, settlers did this to us, or some townspeople. We name the perpetrator, which comes from criminal justice, right? So that means naming the state usually, right? And how it does it. And that's what's broken open, you know, California. And that's certainly what happened up in the Northern Plains. There were very few settlers around because it was a very violent place because of the pre-invasion colonization patterns that were going on. And so what you had to do is bring in military to bring in the so-called settlers, because the settlers, they can't use this as an excuse, but the settlers are being, in a way, manipulated by the dominant state to provide the overall population, right? And so if we focus too much, for instance, on, you know, however we identify the dominant society, whites, you know, settlers, non-indigenous or whatever, or it could be the various people that have formed these ideologies in Israel, then we lose the sense that the state did this, the state organized it, the state supported it, the state paid for it, the state got the militias together, and of course the military. And a linkage to that you were referring to so well, Alam, was one of the statements by the professor of our own university who made an incredible statement, but not so incredible when we see how this, because all this was done with indigenous peoples. This was done with Pine Ridge, this done with the Trail of Tears. This was done in Virginia. This was done incredibly in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And that is where the state reinterprets what has happened and does not take any responsibility for it, because it sees it as either in response to what it calls a just war, or what it does to some provocation, which is really some form of resistance on the part of people that are being destroyed in this process. So the particular thing that was said in those communications was those people had a chance to get out of their buildings, okay, because we all know this, the technology of destruction is so high. a lot of that is from United States military technology of Israel, that they actually know who's living in all those apartments and they have their phone numbers and text. So they hit them up with all this stuff. Say, get out of the building now, you're about to be destroyed, which gives them plausible deniability. Well, if they stayed there, it's their own fault, you know, or they were covering for somebody. But we need to turn that on its head. If the state has this technology, then how did all those children die? If the state has this technology, then how are all those medical facilities hit, right? In other words, the state knows exactly what it's doing, and it's providing this other idea that we're responding, it's either a just war, or we're responding to some provocation, or we're protecting our own people. And what we've done some analysis, none of it's been published or whatever. It's risen from when I was younger to, we look at it maybe a 2 to 1, 4 to 1, gradually a 10 to 1. And I do genocide studies. I do hardcore genocide studies. I coined the term culturicides. I said, if I don't have a lot of dead bodies on the ground, establishing intentionality, I'm going to call it something else, culturicide, cultural genocide, something like that, right? But if you count those dead bodies, Israel, and I apologize because I know people are going to probably give me a hard time about this elsewhere, because they always do, is exactly like the United States. As its dominance increases, the kill ratio increases, right? So they might start off at 5 to 1, 4 to 1, 3 to 1, then it went from 10 to 1. Last time, a while ago on a larger scale, I believe we were looking at about a 41 kill ratio, minimum of 21 to kill ratio. So they get 20 dead bodies of any age and gender, and that's what happened at Nantucket. That's what happened at Pine Ridge, you know, and I have all those stories. And then they almost always get this kill ratio. And then if you look at that use of technology, it seems to me the intentionality of the state is clearly identified in evidentiary. So I'll leave that at that, but it's this connection of looking at settler colonialism. Yes, settlers are being used and are participating to their own benefit, but the state is orchestrating the situation.
Thank you, Dr. Fennell. Before I open it up for other, the other speakers to comment, I just want to explain to the audience, the listeners, since this is getting a little bit technical and a little bit more academic, for many people who belong to the post-colonial school of thought, impacted by the work of Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Spivak, etc. We usually use the term settler colonialism to distinguish it from classic or traditional colonialism, in that settler colonialism entails the colonization process to be permanent, to be based on the genocide of one nation, making room for a new nation, which are usually called the settlers, right? And Dr. Fenelon is opposed to that for the reasons he just explained. But I also want to add something very quickly, that in the Palestinian context, I remember when I grew up in Palestine and I lived like half of my life there, Palestinians usually use the word mustamara or mustamarat, which means colony or colonies, and not mustawtana, mustawtanat, settlements or settlements. So they actually, in the Palestinian psyche for a long period of time, but of course, Israel enforced that language on us. And some people just, sometimes use the tools of the colonizers or the language of the colonizer and use it. But I remember, very clearly that most Palestinians would use the word colonies and colonizers, not necessarily settlements and settlers. And I will open it up for other people. Yes, go ahead, Dr.
I was just going to say pretty much what you just said, Aslam, and that is, you cannot, if you're new to this topic, you cannot learn even half of what is happening in the world today unless you study. This is a place of intellectualism. This is a place of inquiry, and I would just urge the students and even the professors who are attending this event today to just study, read articles, read, of course, the best one to start with is Edward Said. But there are so many others who have, much better than I, who have done excellent analyses of what is happening in Palestine. So I would just urge you, with any topic, so in many ways you don't have a right to give your opinion unless you know what is going on. And I know that sounds harsh, but I do believe that that it is wrong to just say, oh, that's anti-Semitism, when you don't know what is going on. I remember the debate around South Africa. These folks have brought in culture to these African people. They have done all of these wonderful things, and yet you walk into a township in South Africa and it's like being in the 14th century or something. It is just horrible what was done to and what still is in many ways being done to people in South Africa. So I guess what you were also implying, Ahlam, and that is study, make yourself familiar with. And I also wanted to mention, I thought when Jim was talking about California, the first thing I thought of was the missions. This is another phenomenon around which there's so much propaganda, the California missions. And that was settler colonialism. Those Franciscans came to California to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to prepare California for the conquistadors, and to prepare them for the takeover and the genocide of Native Americans. And so when your children who are, I think California has a rule that in third grade they have to visit a mission, you take it from there. If you want to send your kid to a mission, send them to a mission, but prepare them, teach them before they go.
I had to do this with my son last week.
So did I. Yeah, they still have that rule, and it's I think it's horrible. I think it's horrible because all I can think of is the blood of Native Americans and those beautiful flowers and trees surrounding those missions, and the blood that was used to build those missions.
Would anyone else like to comment? And I know probably Dr. Fenelon thinking that colonies, settlements, that's not the point. The bigger point is to name the state, right? So I will keep that in mind. We had wonderful conversations. Dr. Qutami, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. This is just such an important and really interesting discussion. And Dr. Fenelon, I think I just need to really think about some of the things that you bring up. I think they're really important. I've been thinking a little bit about settler colonialism as a concept, and why, for example, there's so much more, it's so much more mobilized into our vocabulary, particularly those who are writing or thinking or teaching about Palestine in the last decade. And I think there are two things that shouldn't necessarily be kind of confused with each other. On the one hand, like when we think of settler colonialism as a field, like in an academic sense that kind of emerges in the late 90s and really starts to sort of gain traction in the last 15 years. A lot of that was founded by, quite frankly, white scholars who were writing about indigenous peoples throughout history, who gave this very kind of archetypical definition of what settler colonialism is, in a way that got mobilized. And I think that there is even an erasure of indigenous thinkers and communities and creators in the way that the field was created and disseminated. And we look back at the work of Palestinian scholars from the 1950s and 60s, or, indigenous scholars of the Kingdom of Hawaii, in that same period, they might not have used the term settler colonialism, but they are very clear about what they mean about the differences between colonization that's just there to extract land and resources and labor versus a colonization where a foreign people are settling permanently and naturalizing their claims to the history and the land, right? But on the other hand, there's a really productive political purpose for Palestinians mobilizing settler colonialism into their discourse and activism today. And it's not an over-centering or an over-glorification of the 1990s and 2000s scholars. It's more about what I was referencing earlier, which is that since the early 1990s peace process, regarded as the Oslo Accords, Palestinian communities and issues have been fractured and segmented into different rubrics. So when we talk about Gaza, we're only talking about siege. When we talk about Jerusalem, we're only talking about the Palestinians of Jerusalem and ethnic cleansing campaigns. When we talk about the West Bank, we're talking about occupation. When we talk about Palestinians inside with Israeli citizenship, we're talking about second-class citizenship, right? And the peace process really dismembered the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was the primary political reference point for the Palestinians prior to 93. And it also dismembered the Palestinian organized national vocabulary that was really centered on the refugee right of return and the liberation of all of the historic lands of Palestine. So now when folks are bringing back the term settler colonialism, what they're saying is that it's not just about 15 years of blockade in Gaza. It's not just about the occupation of the West Bank. It's about all of historic Palestine. It's about a state dropping on a people, a colonial state dropping on a people and settling themselves in the historical narrative and on the land as if they are, indigenous people, or covering up the fact that it is a colonial enterprise. And I think that a lot of well-meaning Palestinian political organizers and thinkers are returning to settler colonialism as a word or as a concept in order to signify that, rather than an erasure of their own ancestors and other indigenous siblings who've long been talking about the particularities between settlement and what that means versus extractive kind of colonialism. And I just really appreciate the references being brought to South Africa a lot, because when we think of South Africa, it's always about apartheid, apartheid, apartheid. But the apartheid regime began in 1948, and it was, 3 centuries of colonialism, settler colonialism, settlers coming in and naturalizing their presence and their dominance in the land, right? That preceded apartheid, and that still anchors the continuous struggle for a redistribution of land, wealth, power, and rights in the present moment in South Africa. So I appreciate that because I do think, there's a lot of intersection with the question of apartheid, but apartheid alone or segregation alone can't actually capture the totality of the political context.
And by the way, Dr. Qutami and I we were on a, conference / teaching tour about South Africa, and it was about the intersectionality between the Palestinian struggle and the South African struggle. And we actually went to the women's hostel, if you remember, Loubna, and witnessed what Dr. Texiera just explained in details. The terrible, material conditions under which many South African Blacks, still live under. So thank you for bringing that up.
If I might clarify something just a little bit.
Sure.
That is, I'm not against the use of the term settler colonialism. I just believe the term should be seen as a subset of colonialism, and to see the primary initiative as coming from the state. The so-called settlers willingly participate and benefit from it, and a set of ideologies, that's actually in my new work right now, a set of ideologies arise from that, which the state manipulates. So I don't reject the term, but I reject it as being too comprehensive without analyzing the state as establishing, what's going on. And that's the importance. What you're saying is to always see this as either a form of neo-colonialism or that uses the colonialisms of the past, to produce these new forms of dominance. And so the inculcation of settlers, in fact, one of the ones that I use a lot, both in the Virginia colony, I've really got some good stuff. I'm redoing so-called Bacon's Rebellion and all that kind of stuff with that, is to see that the colonists that become the settlers themselves are being manipulated. Half of them die both at Plymouth and at Jamestown in the first year. So, and the state, the companies related to the Crown Authority are just, bringing in more because they're replying that, right? But ultimately they become the dominant population and they kill. The other part of it is that now going along the West Bank, the second trip, which the first time it was mostly in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, seeing the walls, right? But now you can see that the settlements that have settler roads, that only settlers and their supporter, the roads are only for them. And the settler roads go to the settlements, usually on the high ground, so that they can control a line of fire down into the valley. And again, that's all state imposed. That's state tactics. That's state control. So yeah, I don't reject the term. I just think we need to be careful about using it.
Thank you so much for that clarification. So now we have some time for Q&A, and I see Professor Bastami's hand, but first we had a comment in the chat, and then I will give it to you. And the comment says, if there is, I don't know if it was in the chat or sent as a question, from Nathaniel Whitworth, if there is time, I'd love to hear more on advice about engaging our fellow academics and administrators on this issue beyond and in addition to the good advice for them to study from any of the speakers. I think I would like to start with Dr. Rofel, and then if anyone else would like to add, we'll go there, just because I know you actually did a lot of that engagement with administrators and the institutional side of things when you were the coordinator of California Scholars for Academic Freedom.
Well, I believe in a grassroots model of organizing from the bottom up. So it took us many years of work in the California Scholars for Academic Freedom and on my campus to build a group of people who were willing to act collectively to press different administrators on different campuses. And so that would be my first advice, is to find out on your particular campus who is with you, who would support, the work that you would like to do on your campus. I wouldn't start out just calling up an administrator and saying, we would like to see you make a statement, because administrators, they respond to different pressures, and you have to build that pressure on them. So, so that's how California Scholars actually basically does that. And now we have a constituency of over 200 people from throughout California who can, yes, speak to these administrators. And then on my own campus, similarly, I did some events and then built figured out who was with me. And we also have a group called Faculty Organizing Group. That's a group of progressive faculty who then began to work with me. And especially we started working on protecting or supporting, I should say, Students for Justice in Palestine, because they were getting just horrible harassment. That was one action we took, was to show up for all their events and be observers to the kind of harassment they received, and then the lies that are told afterwards about them. So once we started showing up and the people who tell those lies knew that we were showing up, they stopped telling those lies. So you kind of have to do, yeah, that would be my advice. And then we did eventually march into the chancellor's office and say, this is what we want, this is what you need to do, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there, again, I think you have to figure out what are the relevant demands on your campus. One, of course, is to not, to support the right of Students for Justice in Palestine to speak out. Another is, there are lots of ways that Zionists try to ruin the careers of students, like the Canary Mission list, and you can talk to your administrators about how they should speak out against that, and how they should be willing to write in favor of the students who are getting demonized and speak out for them. So those would be two, I would say, on the campus. We also got our Faculty Academic Senate to pass certain resolutions condemning that kind of harassment of students. And that went all the way up to the system-wide Academic Senate, where resolutions have been passed and sent along to the central administration of the University of California. So there are a lot of different, sadly, sad is not the, infuriatingly, things that need to be done to fight back against the attempts to suppress the right to speak out for Palestinian freedom. So, but as I say, the place to begin is to figure out who your allies are on your campus and then broadly, maybe throughout the CSU system.
Thank you, Dr. Rofel. We're talking about the Senate. We are still waiting for our Senate actually to speak against the racist email, since the racist email landed or was posted on the listserv of the Senate. If there is
and
no...
I also, I'm sorry, Alam, but may I say one thing just in terms of perspective, that speaking of universities, we are in a very, what I would call a privileged place, because we are able so far to speak about this. But there are a number of universities and an increasing number of universities where Zionists are insisting that we be silenced. Those of us who talk about the suffering and the pain of what is going on in Palestine, those voices are being silenced. So we need to understand that and to know that this is not just a cavalier kind of, wouldn't it be nice to have this discussion? There are very serious consequences to people who have discussions like this on campuses.
Dr. Rofel, I'll take your comment, and then we have...
Yes, very quick.
I think had his hand for some time now, so I want to give him after you.
Thank you, Dr. Texera. That is really important to remember. And I wanted to, I don't know if people know about the organization called Palestine Legal. They are fabulous, and they will help you for free. And the rest of us can give them donations, help you for free with legal backing should you be faced with this kind of harassment. They're just really terrific.
All right, thank you so much. So Professor Bastami, can he actually unmute? Can you try to unmute? I'm not sure if you can unmute or not. Or maybe Dr. Murray, you need to unmute him.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, and I'm gonna ask it. All right, can you unmute?
Can you all hear me?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you everyone for this amazing panel. Thank you, Dr. Rofel, for being here. I will try to keep it as short as I can, but I wanted everybody to know that I am thanking every single one of you, Dr. Fennell, Dr. Mutasab, Dr. Teixeira, Dr. Qutami, and everybody else, Dr. Murray. My comment, my question is based on my understanding of the situation and my reading of the articles and talking to as many people as I can. It is most definitely uninformed and probably not that accurate anyway. Given the situation right now, and given that I think we study history and we study the nature of colonization and apartheid to give a better understanding, not just to ourselves, but provide it to our students and move the discussion forward, I think my question is what needs to be done next in terms of, for example, if I wanted to, because I do talk about this particular issue in my classes because they're global related and all that stuff, and I get questions of what needs to be done. When I try to explain the history and the technical aspects of colonization and apartheid, a lot of our students need a little bit of a background and so on and so forth. But here's my understanding. Going forward, options are very simple. Either Palestinians will get their own land of independence, either Israel will continue this oppression and this brutality, or Palestinians would be forced to leave the land, which is technically ethnic cleansing. So what is the next, what is the outlook? What is, I don't know how to finish that question. So I hope you all can guide me through it. Thank you so much again for the panel.
Perception also of a solution beyond the two-state solution that doesn't exist anymore. All right, who would like to start?
I can give it a go.
So, and you can address both issues, the one brought up by Nathaniel or the one brought up by Professor Bastami.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Bastami. It's a great question. The first thing is that I do want to sort of make a little announcement that the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which is a new US-based body of Palestinian women, Palestinian Arab women and feminists, is releasing a toolkit tomorrow, which basically includes an organization of the plethora of materials that already exist. So how to take action, how to engage in Palestine organizing, how to teach Palestine, how to engage in scholarly and academic solidarity with Palestine, learning resources, social media resources. So please follow our Facebook page, Palestinian Feminist Collective, or Instagram page to have access to that, because I think what we're finding is that there really is a lot of material out there, but sometimes it's hard to access it all in one place. And so that's kind of the goal with this toolkit, so that people coming in to the question of Palestine at any entry point, whether they're a beginner just learning about it or someone who really wants to figure out how to engage deeper or more, can support. In terms of the broader political question, I think the issue is that there's a lot of myths and myths about the Palestinian political side that kind of obscures the actual dynamic of the relationships. And I just want to say really clearly, the Palestinian official political leadership already ceded 78% of historic Palestine in the early 1990s. They had already agreed to let down their arms, to put down their arms. They went to a table saying, we will put down our arms, we will forget the 78% of historic Palestine, our 5 million Palestinian refugees outside of Palestine. Who cares about them? They don't need to return. And still, the Israeli occupation did not stop. In fact, the rate of settlement expansion in the West Bank between 1993 and 2000 was faster than the settlement expansion was between 1967 and 1993.
It was almost the double, actually.
Almost double, right? And so this is the biggest myth when people say Hamas, terrorism, the PLO, Palestinians being uncooperative, hating Jews, wanting to wipe. I mean, all of that is just unbelievable if you actually look historically and see that the Palestinians gave up everything without anything in exchange. You will see that those myths will have to be debunked, right? And so I think right now, what is very, very clear is that we do not want to enter into negotiations where Palestinians give up more land, more rights, fracture their own society even more, betray their own people even more. Meanwhile, the occupation is persisting. So the demands are really clear: ending the occupation, ending the siege, full justice and freedom, right of return. If the international community, if the Israeli state is not willing to comply with those demands, then Palestinians will continue resisting. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad or right or wrong, but it is the natural thing that any occupied and colonized people will do if they are being occupied and colonized. They will resist until they attain their freedom. And the international community has a choice to make whether they want to see more and more decades of constant fighting and wars and sieges and exoduses, or whether they are going to help realize an end to this catastrophe that's gone on for far too long. And so I think that is what the Palestinians are saying is the only solution: freedom. And that doesn't mean harming or injuring or hurting Jewish peoples, right? And I think Palestinians organizers, political organizers, have been very clear that a struggle against Zionism is not a struggle against Jewish peoples. And as Lisa's talk indicated today, Jewish communities are one of the largest and most important constituents of the Palestine liberation movement, right? We're doing this in a shoulder-to-shoulder struggle as people who want to coexist together in a free Palestine in the future, but not a Palestine that's occupied and colonized, right?
Thank you very much. Who would like to address this next? Any part of those two issues?
Well said. Well said.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually, if I may, I'm not one of the speakers, but I guess a very, very crucial topic that we kind of skip is the, well, it was mentioned, but not some details, is the military cooperation between the United States and Israel, and focusing on our military aid to Israel every year out of our own tax money, $3.8 billion annually to Israel. And also the latest slap in the face of Palestinians was the Biden administration approving a a sale of targeted missiles and they call them smart bombs, very smart, to Israel in the amount of $735 million. Now, this is unbelievable. And Boeing, you know, if you want to talk about the boycott that Professor Rofel actually emphasized in her talk at the beginning, this is an important, you know, aspect to talk about. Boeing actually profiting from the colonization of Palestine, but also profiting from the slaughter in Gaza, the slaughter of men, women, and children in Gaza who had nothing, who have done nothing actually except living in their houses, basically. So if we maybe address that a little bit, that's also important. All right, do we have any other questions, Professor Murray, that we need to address, or comments?
When we talk about solutions, we, you know, obviously, you know, the term BDS has been bandied about. I'm wondering if there's anyone on the panel who can really talk about what we as individuals do in regard to these solutions, like BDS. I know that's only one solution, but would anybody, I know I'm not supposed to be asking the questions, but you know, I too would like to hear someone talk about BDS.
Sure, who would like to take this on? Dr. Rofel? Or...
Sure. So boycott, divestment, sanction has an academic, cultural, and economic three aspects to it. And there are a lot of very local campaigns with regard to this. So, for example, there is a Jewish Voice for Peace has organized a Stop the Deadly Exchange program. So you know that US police go to Israel to get trained by the Israeli police. And there are, so then one focus could be in your city or town or wherever you are to end that exchange with your local police. That would be one specific thing to do. A second specific thing, well, I don't know, most of you are probably on Facebook and other social media. I am not, actually. But again, there is a campaign because Zionists have lobbied Facebook to basically suppress all speech about Palestinian rights on Facebook. And they have been doing this. They have actually been doing this without calling it a whole policy yet. We have, and so if people want to think about a way to address that, whether you want to start a local campaign around on your university campus, Zoom is another problem. Whether you want to start a campus campaign against using them, etc. That's another thing. Also, in terms of boycott, if you're in a professional academic association, we have created a lot of boycott resolutions, and you could work to bring that about in your professional association. Also, specific companies have been targeted, like Ahlam just said about Boeing. There have been a lot of specific companies targeted who do business with, clearly with illegal settlements. And that would be worth identifying if you're, again, local area, or if you want to go national. If certain companies have, like the, what is it called, G4S? Anyway, that technology, surveillance technology.
4G.
What's it called?
4G.
4G, yeah, I knew. I was like, because like I said, I'm not big on, yeah. So there's a big campaign pressuring them to stop doing business with Israeli settlements. The academic boycott means that we here in the United States will not go and support any Israeli universities that are actively involved in the occupation, which is basically all of them. Basically, and because they're on Palestinian land, and or they develop military technologies, etc. And so these academic boycotts are very, very important. And the Israeli state itself has created a whole separate office saying that BDS is their most important threat. That's what they're very, very worried about, actually. So these boycotts can be very effective. So, and then there have been, of course, something you can fight. In some states, they have passed these illegal laws saying a company is not allowed to support this boycott against Israel, or we will not give them contracts, these state contracts, and also people who work in a capacity either as a state employee in a public institution like a hospital or university. Some states are claiming they have to sign a pledge. So there are lots of ways to fight back through this BDS, as I say, and I think the local campaigns have been very, very effective. So focus on where you are and see what you find out.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your energy and your amazing, insightful remarks and answers to the questions or interjections. I really appreciate you responding to my request last minute, knowing how busy each one of you is. So thank you so much on behalf of the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab Worlds. And thank you also on behalf of the Conversations on Race and Policing series at CSUSB. We really appreciate it. We hope, I just want to announce before everyone leaves, although I should have announced it earlier, that we are starting actually a parallel series that focuses on justice in Palestine. We might have 1 or 2 events in summer, but we'll start like the series in a more consistent way in fall. So I'm sure we will be requesting you to join us again, our esteemed guests. So thank you, and thank you for everyone who joined us. We will post the recording on the both the website of our center and also on Race and Policing. And can I ask the guests to stay after for a few minutes, if you don't mind, just to recap and have a final thank you notes. All right, have a great day, everyone. Gonna stop recording.